Check, check, check. Check, check. Check, check, check. Check.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this session. Thanks for being here and not with Joe Biden. And also thanks for being here and not with the karaoke people next door. I'm sure they are still open once we are ready here. So welcome to the session. My name is Martina Stefani and I'm the director for Farm Animals and Nutrition at Four Paws International. And this panel is called Closing the Methane Pledge Gap: How the Global North Can Step Up as Champions of the Food System Change. And I have a wonderful all-female panel, which is great. And let me introduce them to you. So I have them on my phone, so just a moment. So with me, virtually joining, is Lena Höglund Isaksson, and she's the senior researcher at the International Institute for Applied System Analysis in Austria. Then we have Sally Smith, she's the Director of ESG and Sustainability at Upfield. Then we have Nusha Orbancic, she's with the Changing Market Foundation, and she leads and oversees the foundation's campaigns, research, and media work. Then we have Gabrielle Dreyfus, she's Chief Scientist at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. And last but not least, we have Sanne Decker, and she works at Friesland Campina R&D on sustainable dairy. Welcome to all of you, and thanks for being with us. And the first one to kick us off and to tell us more about this whole issue is Lena. Lena, over to you.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen. So thank you for inviting me, and good evening to everyone. So so I'm Lena Höglund Isaksson from the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria, and I have the honor to be the first speaker here. So my talk is on how methane emissions can be controlled in the agricultural sector of the European Union, and in particular what we can possibly achieve in this sector in the next decade. But first, a small reminder why it's so important to reduce methane emissions. If we continue with business as usual, the world is heading for exceeding 1.5 degrees warming in the next 2 decades, at great risk for human livelihoods, because also at a temporary exceedance, also a temporary exceedance risks setting off irreversible feedback effects that could spiral out of control. So while reducing CO2 emissions by phasing out the use of fossil fuels is the only path to gain control of global warming in the long run, addressing emissions of the strong but relatively short-lived greenhouse gas, methane, is likely one of the very few options that we still have left to avoid shooting over 1.5 degrees in the next decades. And mitigating methane emissions in all regions and sectors globally is key to keep the world on a manageable level of warming in the short as well as in the long run. So let's look at the European Union. After having achieved a drop in greenhouse gas emissions by 25% since 1990, the European Union decided in 2020 on an ambitious target to reach minus 55% by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. This will require a complete decarbonization of the energy, transport, and industrial sectors. And what will remain in 2050 is almost only non-CO2 greenhouse gases, including methane, from the agricultural sector. So to reach net zero, these emissions must be offset through carbon sinks, for example, afforestation, and or carbon dioxide, methane removal technologies, like carbon capture and storage or direct atmospheric removal. But the possibilities for offsetting emissions through these methods will likely remain technically and financially limited. So it's very important that we minimize emissions as much as possible across all sectors. So what has the EU achieved in terms of methane emissions? Well, EU's overall methane emissions dropped by about 20% since 2005 and are expected to continue to drop by another 32% until 2050. But as you can see here, these drops in emissions are almost exclusively happening in the waste and energy sectors, where many policies have already been implemented. But in the agricultural sector, as you see here, we have seen a very modest reduction of 8%. And we don't see very much larger reductions in the future. So where do EU's agricultural methane emissions come from? Well, to 98%, they come from livestock systems, and to 75% alone from dairy and non-dairy cattle systems. And in these systems, most of emissions come from enteric fermentation in the rumens of the cattle, and only a smaller part come from manure management. And the modest decline in emissions that we have seen already comes from slight declines in animal stocks due to feed efficiency and productivity enhancements, as well as implementation of biogas digesters for the treatment of manure, in particular on pig farms, and often driven by policy incentives such as feed-in tariffs or subsidies in several that are in place in several EU member states. So about 60% of methane emissions from EU livestock comes from large farms with at least 100 livestock units. And about 75% comes from farms with at least 50 livestock units. And this large scale means that EU livestock farmers have much better financial opportunities to address methane emissions than farmers in many other parts of the world where the farms are smaller and less intensive in terms of livestock systems. But still, the additional technical potential for reducing emissions in EU's agriculture are relatively limited. Well, actually for EU's livestock systems, is relatively limited. In 2030, it's about 12%, and in 2050, about double. And most of that is in dairy and non-dairy cattle systems, and particular for enteric fermentation from breeding and different feed changes. So what technical options are there to reduce methane emissions from livestock? Well, if we start with the enteric fermentation, you can do dedicated breeding schemes, but you have to make sure that it's done with a dual objective of promoting traits that enhance productivity, while also maintaining animal health, fertility, and longevity. But such schemes would take at least 10 years to run before you would see any effects on emissions. Breeding only for productivity enhancement risks increasing overall emissions. So it's important that you also look for traits for animal health. And for the other option would be different feed changes and feed additives. And for the latter, the most promising ones would be the 3-NOP and red seaweed, which have been shown to deliver at least 20% emission reductions without compromising animal productivity. We have seen more extensive reductions of over 60% or even 90% in some in vitro studies, but these are not likely possible in more realistic settings. But the applicability of these are likely to be limited to large farms that can effectively and safely deliver the right doses to the animals, because these additives are toxic to the animals in higher doses. It's also likely that they can only be distributed when the animals are kept indoor, which would further limit the applicability of these measures. For manure management, the option that we see is to treat manure in anaerobic digesters for biogas generation. And this potential can still be extended in the EU. But you need to co-digest the manure with other organic waste for the process to be effective. And we assume that the applicability is limited to large farms with liquid manure management systems, because digesting manure from solid systems and on smaller farms would be more difficult and costly to operate. But this may change in the future with developments of more automatized technologies. To achieve more substantial cuts in methane emissions in the mid to long run, we must go beyond the technical solutions and find measures to reduce the size of animal stocks. And this can be done through two different avenues. You can use supply side measures, which is support for transitions to more extensive systems, for example, through stricter standards for biodiversity and animal health protection. And this would also address other pollutants like ammonia, which is becoming a major contributor to particle emissions in both rural and urban areas in the EU. And in fact, more regulations that protect more circular farming practices are called for by many farmers currently operating smaller and organic farms, but such efforts are often opposed by groups lobbying for agro-industry. Or you can do demand side measures, which would curb demand for milk and meat consumption through economic instruments like taxes that increase the prices relative plant-based protein sources. But in both cases, you would see consumer prices for milk and meat would increase, which raises some further issues that would need to be addressed separately. For example, well, the overall reduced intake of meat is likely to improve the general health of the population, but there are some groups that would need some special attention, like securing that meeting nutritional needs is affordable for children and women in fertile ages, for example. And there would also need to be some kind of regulations on the import and export to avoid emissions leakage to other world regions that produce milk and meat using more emission intensive methods. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lena, for this very interesting insights. And I'm sure that some people already have questions, but please keep them till the end of the session, because you will now hear a different perspective from Sana. Sana, what's your perspective?
All right. Good evening, everybody. Good that you managed to stay here all day. It's been a long day with a lot of presentations, so thank you for being here. My name is Sanne Dekker. I work for Friesland Campina, but I'm also active in international frameworks like the European Dairy Association and the International Dairy Federation. I have a PhD in animal production systems, and I've worked for Friesland Campina now for 10 years in research, analyzing carbon footprints and working with our farmers and our customers to reduce those numbers. So this is my footprint. These are two tools that you can fill in the Netherlands that show your environmental footprint. I'm not doing very well like most Dutch people. I mean, I don't have much lower score or higher score than anyone else in the Netherlands. On the left, you see an environmental footprint, and on the right, you see a carbon footprint. And just to put things a little bit in perspective, my best option is not to fly here, not to drive a car. I got myself a bike basket to bring my kids to school to reduce kilometers I drive, and not to buy as much stuff as I did last year. So that's important to start off with. Then what's also important that we all realize that the animal-based and the arable systems are interconnected. And I try to put that in a picture here where you can see that the way the agricultural system is right now, manure is used to grow arable crops. And then, for example, when you grow soybeans and you make soy drinks from it, you get pulp and you get the juice. The juice you can sell to consumers, but the pulp often goes to animal farming. Same for sunflower seeds, where you get expeller and oil. That's what's interconnected. And splitting those two systems up or taking something out of the system might not improve efficiency of both systems. For example, if you take manure out of the system, your productivity of your arable crops per hectare will go down. And that's something to consider when you're talking about protein transitions, of course. How do we keep the system as productive as possible? And then also what's important when you're comparing carbon footprints from animal-based and plant-based systems is that the emissions of making the manure are not accounted for in arable footprints. And so that's why I put the red stripes. That's as such okay, but when you start comparing them, it's something to keep in mind. This is a plot of land of one of our farmers. We did a very extensive research on carbon sequestration on dairy farms. And this is a farmer that rents out his land to an arable farmer to grow for 1 year potatoes and then put it back into grassland. And what you see is that the carbon stocks are really dropping and that it takes like 4 years to get back to the carbon stock that was there when it was grassland. So that's also a way how the systems are connected. And what's also important to consider is that a lot of land that we're using for livestock, and I think all of you have heard this many times before today because it has been said in many of the dairy sessions, are not very fit for growing something else than grassland. This is also from research from one of my colleagues showing that you also need to take into account the nutritional value of plant-based drinks versus dairy. If you read a little bit the literature, there's plenty of discussion on that, so something to keep in mind. And then what I really like to emphasize is we all need to go to as low possible footprints in the future. these are the 8 biggest dairy companies. They've all committed to science-based targets. And I really sincerely hope that every plant-based industry in Europe and the world will commit to science-based targets, because it's the best way to prove that you're working on reducing emissions, and we all have to do that. And then a little bit of a perspective on, how low can you go with dairy? We've also heard quite a bit about that in the last presentation. This is a research that was actually produced 2 days ago by my colleagues, showing how much the footprint of dairy has reduced in the last 30 years. And we've also done extensive research on how much lower we can go. We've set the science-based target at 33% reduction between 2050 and 2030. And I'm pretty sure that's easy to achieve, because the trend is going in the right direction. We have to step up on the methane. We know how to do that. It was also presented a minute ago. And for 2050, we can reduce emissions up to 70%. And then something else to consider when you're talking about dairy cooperatives, because this is also often misunderstood. A cooperative is owned by the farmers, which means that the profit goes back to the farmers, but also that if you work in a company like mine, you are able to really have a dialogue with your farmers on how to reduce the emissions and to put in place financial incentives for that. And we've done that. So since 2015, we're rewarding our farmers for reducing their emissions. I think that was it. I hope I kept within the 5 minutes.
Thank you, Sana. Thank you. Over to Nusha. What do you think the dairy industry should do?
Okay, that should be better. So we started researching what meat and dairy companies are doing last year, just before COP26. We published a report called Blind Spot, where we looked at 10 of the biggest dairy and 10 of the biggest meat companies. And we've realized that they're not really doing that much when it comes to climate targets. They all have some sort of commitment, but when you start looking more into details, you see they don't report, most of them don't report scope 3. None of them report methane. They're very unclear in terms of like investments that they're making in abatement options, especially on methane. And yeah, given that they have significant footprints, significant climate footprints, we were really kind of, surprised that they're not taking more action in line with what they have they want to be perceived as doing. Also, we were at a very interesting event just now at Dairy Net Zero, which is all focused on efficiency, which could potentially achieve certain things in the global south. But in global north, the FAO representative himself said that we have kind of filled the efficiency gap, right? If you look at European Union, Europeans overconsume dairy products by 25% and meat products by 50%. And we'll look at it only from health guidance. So that doesn't include environmental guidance, but health guidance. So basically, I don't believe that there's a lot of efficiency improvements possible in global north. And I don't believe that even if you look at globally, what Donald Moore said is like, we have increased efficiency by a certain percentage, but we also increased production by 30%. So the emissions went up. So my question to the dairy industry is like, well, if you have failed previously, why do you think now this time it will be different? And shouldn't we be focusing on other things that make more sense, because we are in a climate emergency? Methane represents, so livestock sector is 32% of methane globally, 53% in Europe, 39% in the US. If you look at other regions, Brazil, it's 75%. New Zealand is 80%, and it's growing. It has been growing, but we don't have any policies to put this under control. That's why, a lot of our reports kind of talk about blind spot when it comes to methane, because it is really urgent. We must reduce this gas in order to stay under 1.5 degrees, as Lena mentioned, but the biggest sector is off the hook, and they're selling us this dream about efficiency improvements. I'll just park it there, but we can talk about it a bit more, what the solutions are.
Thank you so much. So Sally, what do you think responsible businesses should do to lower their methane emissions?
Hi guys, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Sally Smith and I work for Upfield. Upfield's a plant-based food company, so we have products around the world that provide alternatives to dairy. So alternatives to cheese, alternatives to cream, alternatives to butters, basically, and they are delicious and fantastic. And I'm sure a number of you have tried many of them over the years and know just how great they are. And from our perspective, when we look at this, we look with slight horror, maybe, when we look at the scale of the problem. So I think some of Lena's charts at the beginning show in really strong detail, right, just how much impact comes from meat and dairy, both on greenhouse gases, but specifically on this topic of methane. And we know that tackling methane now, not in 10 years' time when some of the solutions are scalable or possible, but now is just utterly essential, right? Utterly essential for every single one of you, every single one of the people out there, every single one of the people on the planet. We've got to do something quite radically different, start to have conversations and do things that we perhaps find uncomfortable and don't want to do. And we want to talk about what we eat as well as how it's made, right? So let's not detract from the good work that's been done and should continue to be done to improve the way in which both meat, dairy and livestock are currently raised. That is critically essential, but we have to get into the conversation what we eat, what we choose to eat, particularly in high income countries where we radically overconsume has to be on the table. And as a responsible business, from our perspective, the things that you can do are, number one, be really transparent about your impact, set absolute targets for reduction, and share what you're doing on it. So from our perspective, back in January this year, after COP26, when it became really apparent that there was this gap between the 30% action plan in the global methane pledge, which is fantastic, but there's the opportunity to do more in that, right? The gap between that and the 45% that the UNEP says is necessary to keep 1.5 on track, that gap can be closed with food systems, and particularly the shift in diets from plant-based becoming more forward and more prevalent in diets across particularly rich countries, right, where we radically overconsume. And so when we saw that, we were like, well, what can we do? What's the thing that we can uniquely do in the position that we hold as a plant-based food company? And we looked at whether we could disclose our methane emissions. So we all talk about greenhouse gas disclosure, and we'd already disclosed very clearly our full scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, made commitments to put carbon labels on 500,000 packs around the world, inform consumers about the difference that shifting to plant-based can make. But how do we tackle this methane question because of the urgency of it, the absolute imperative emergency of it? And so we thought it was going to take ages, to actually get to a number. Let's be clear, it took 2 weeks. You take your existing inventory, you get some clever scientists who know that greenhouse gas accounting takes into account all equivalencies, and in those requirements, it includes methane already, and they need to put a spreadsheet to it, add up some numbers and give you a pretty good indication of how much methane you have as a company, right? And it showed us some great insights, some fantastic insights as a company about where our methane comes from, what we can do about it, and the targets that we can set to tackle our emissions and our footprint now, today, not when the technology comes or when it's scalable or when some of these things are available possibly at some point in the future, right? So there are things that you can do now, today, by eating some really delicious food that can absolutely help. And so from our perspective, we would love to see the methane pledge include wider commitments that include the agricultural sector. I think it's really important that those mechanisms are utilized, and that we encourage companies to disclose their methane. Look at it, see what it says if you're in the food company, have a go, right? You might learn something and realize that there's other stuff that you can do that isn't currently in your plan. And we know there's a gap, so let's fix it, right?
Thank you so much. Clap. And the methane pledge is actually the perfect buzzword to hand over to Gabrielle, because you know all about that. And maybe you can let us know how this pledge can help to push sustainable farming systems.
Thanks. So I'm Gabrielle Dreyfus. All right. My name is Gabrielle Dreyfus. I am the chief scientist with the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development, but I'm also here as a member of the scientific advisory panel for the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. So this is the same CCAC that is under UNEP, so under the UN Environment Program, and in 2021 released the Global Methane Assessment. It's a very useful report that gathered all these sources of information on methane and catalyzed in a way the launch of the Global Methane Pledge that was officially launched at COP26 in Glasgow, but originally it was the US, the European Union, and 8 other countries who started it in September of last year. President Biden was just speaking that there are over 130 countries now that have joined the pledge, over 50% of emissions. Something very important to keep in mind when talking about the Global Methane Pledge is that it is a collective, global, voluntary goal to reduce emissions by at least 30% below 2020 levels by 2030. So it is giving us a direction. At this point, there are discussions, and the CCAC actually just last week released a follow-up to the Global Methane Assessment, their baseline report, which I recommend everyone look at, that starts to look at trajectories of where our expected human-made methane emissions are going under current policies. And the results are actually a reason why this panel is so important, and other methane discussions are, is absent additional intentional actions and targets and programs and regulations, we're expecting to see an increase in human methane emissions, human-caused methane emissions, of 13% by 2030. So the wrong direction. So Lena started with a great graph. This is something that I and some of our other speakers spoke to this. The reason we're talking so much about methane is that we've been really slow on tackling the global warming issue. And it's gotten to a point where 20 years ago, we were talking about climate change impacts as a future event. Later this century, 2100. Unfortunately, we're seeing those impacts now, today, and how severe they can be. And this is why methane is such an important, what we call a short-lived climate pollutant to tackle. And there's been a lot of attention to the energy sectors, the energy extractive sectors, which are comparable in their total emissions to the agricultural sector, but where there's easier solutions. A lot of that methane that's released doesn't have to leak. It was built into the system when people didn't care. Methane wasn't a problem 10 years ago. It was barely on the radar. Agricultural systems are complicated. We see that. And the livestock sector is one that is interconnected. Something actually, well, I'll get back to this, but I'll put this question in people's minds right now, because a lot of this is an accounting problem. So who should account for the methane emissions associated with fertilizer, ammonia fertilizer production? Currently, those methane emissions, methane is used, so natural gas is both a feedstock and an energy source in ammonia production. And there have been very few studies that look at specifically the leakage of methane, natural gas associated with ammonia production, but the few that do exist, so that it's large, but that's currently accounted for in the energy production space, not the agricultural space. And so this is one of the things, as I think your call is very good, to look at those supply chain sources to better characterize where there may be actually opportunities. So going back to where I started, the Global Methane Pledge, global, not yet sector specific, although there was an announcement earlier this summer on an energy pathway. So again, focusing on energy. I'm a big believer in start with what you know how to do and strengthen. I come from the Montreal Protocol background, and that's how we got on top of the ozone hole. You know, we can do this, but you start with the things you know. In agriculture, it's really great to exchange information and practices to understand where there's opportunity. So in the global methane assessment from 2021, Lena actually, in her analysis, has all the numbers. So I'm going to leave the numbers to Lena. But as some of our speakers have said, there are regions that are very high consumers of animal-based products, where adopting a healthy diet, I think, you know, this is defined in various ways. I'm not going to define it here. You probably all know this better than I do. Can reduce emissions associated, methane emissions by about 4.4%. That's pretty good. Whereas adopting a more strictly plant-based diet, I think it almost doubles it. It's like 7%. So these are really important changes. And again, I think this panel, and you pointed out, I am very sensitive to the fact that it's really the over-consuming regions that have an opportunity to make change here, that it's not, you know, when you have smallholder farmers with 1 or 2 cows for their family and livelihood, that's a different conversation. And that in terms of what opportunities there are there to include increased productivity while reducing the methane emissions per kilogram of protein produced. So that's a different set of conversations. So I appreciate the nuance because I think the level of detail and analysis is where it becomes possible to have the more specific, and I think Lena had a lot of detail in her graphs to identify where there's real opportunity. So I hope that helps. Methane Pledge, drawing a lot of attention. President Biden spent a lot of time talking about methane. I was kind of impressed, like this guy knows his methane stuff. I'm hoping other global leaders, Europe has also been a leader in this, will learn their methane basics to keep this high on the radar, because it does have significant implications for the climate, but also health and economic and other aspects. Something like that.
Thank you so much. Awesome. So listening to you, I already get the feeling that there might be different asks for policymakers on an international and on a national level. And actually, that's my question to each of you. And I don't know, Lena, are you still with us? Because then we could start with Lena. I see that
I'm
our
here.
technical team, you're here, but we can't see you. So
can you hear me?
We wait until, yeah, we can hear you, but let's wait until we can see you again. So I will start with you, Sana, and then I go over to you, Lena, because we want to see you while you're speaking. The question is what you think governments should do on a national and on an international level to reduce emissions from agriculture.
Basically, well, take off my glasses because otherwise I won't see you. The reading glasses. Basically, what governments could do and should do, of course, is setting boundaries on all kinds of environmental impacts. Nitrogen, phosphorus, GHG emissions. Not working? Yes, working. That has already been done in Europe. Now the next question, and that's what the EU is working on, is the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy to set more legislation to motivate companies, farmers to reduce emissions. So positive incentives, subsidies, funding, financial options to reduce emissions. Of course, the other thing that has to be done is of course to also set minimum requirements. Those that are not producing within the boundaries, you know, there has to be set minimum standards. And then there's of course also the legislative proposals on the Green Claims Initiative, you know, to make sure that everybody makes fair claims in the market and that consumers are informed about their environmental impact.
Thank you. We have now Lena with us on screen, so we can hear and see you. Over to you, Lena.
Yeah, thank you. So I totally agree with Sanna that I think it's very, very important that governments and other governing bodies like the EU and so on, that they set very strict, that they make very clear rules for the companies. Because of course all companies have to make have to base their investment decisions on some kind of long-term situation. So this is very important. But in there, I think it's important that we get stricter rules in the EU for methane emissions in agriculture. And as I said before, it can also be done through actually the avenues that also Sanna was talking about, that you set stricter rules for the quality of the production, so animal health and so on. But I think also we have to also remember that it's not only methane emissions that is a problem in agriculture, it's also ammonia emissions. And ammonia emissions is something that Europe until now have not been able to address properly. And the ammonia emissions are coming from the agriculture, and in particular from the really large farms. So it's by addressing both the greenhouse gases and the ammonia emissions in agriculture would be very important for human health actually reasons, as well as for ecosystems and so on. But then I think also for agriculture, we also have to look at we cannot only look at methane as I said, but also the whole system, how because right now in Europe, we have very intensive livestock systems in some regions, while lots of the fodder for animals is grown in other parts of Europe, or imported also. A lot is important also, and getting a more circular system for, in particular for nitrogen, would also be very important. So I think there is still a lot of work to do in agriculture in Europe before we are where we want to be, even if it means higher prices on the products.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Lucia, do you have further ideas what governments could and should do on national and international level?
Yeah. Does this work? Yeah. Okay, yeah, so we actually commissioned a study to Dutch consultancy CE Delft to look at the potential of different measures in EU in all three sectors, so energy, waste, and agriculture. And actually, the biggest potential for methane reduction comes from agriculture, so adoption of healthy diets. Most countries, maybe not most, but like around half countries in Europe already have dietary health guidance. So this is like recommendations of how much or what type of food people should be consuming, but they're not implementing those guidance. So this guidance is just sitting somewhere on some website and that's it. So kind of the consultant looked at what would that mean? How much would we have to reduce consumption? And for red meat, it was around 50%. For dairy, it was around 25%. And that would give us 15 to 19% reduction of methane, only that one thing, right? And technical measure, on the other hand, are more uncertain. So they looked at the manure management measures, and that would give like 4 to 7% from the livestock sector, which kind of goes to 2 to 3.5% in overall methane emissions. So actually, and this is also like low cost. because it doesn't really cost you anything to stop over-consuming meat and dairy, right? Because I get really annoyed sometimes when everyone says like emissions reduction in agriculture are super costly. Like, yes, it's super costly if you're trying to reduce efficiency when you're already super efficient. But if you're doing this healthy diets thing, actually, it doesn't cost you anything, and it's actually win-win. It's not just a great climate measure, it's also win for health because people get less dietary diseases. It frees up land potentially for more sustainable farming systems. So it is really something I think the government should be looking at much more seriously, and doing this in collaboration with farmers, of course. So that is one thing that I think is really important. The second thing, we had a really interesting report launched in the UN earlier this week. It was about greenwashing and net zero targets. And actually, one of the main messages that came out of that was that this target shouldn't be voluntary, that they should move towards regulations. It should cover all three scopes. It should be in line with 1.5-degree temperature increase. So I believe that governments should really move towards that. So they should regulate this really enormous companies. A lot of them are based in Europe. Big dairy and meat companies are based in Europe, and set climate targets that are enforced. And yeah, it should move away from the domain of voluntary. I think that's really, really important. I had another point, but I forgot. So I pass over to Sally.
Thank you. Like I said, if it does come back to you, just interrupt. I'm sure it was really important. So, I mean, I think I would echo some of what's already been said, and we recognize that there's been lots of conversations about better, right? How do we make things better? I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the policy changes that might help with less, right? How do we encourage consumers? What are those things that, from a policy perspective, can create the right enabling environment for a shift to more plant-based foods? So there are a number of things in this system at the moment that are tipped into the favor of meat and dairy across that whole enabling environment, because it's the food system we've built, right? It's the way we've built it today. We can unbuild it and build a new one to encourage people to do something else and inspire them to shift and make it fantastic as a delicious eating experience, right? And we know that food is cultural, it's about your heritage, it's about shared experience, but we're all open to new shared experience, right? So how do we create new shared food experiences? And what's the policy environment that can change some of that? So that we know that when we look at subsidies, incentives, taxation, and where that flows in the system at the moment, disproportionately, it doesn't flow towards plant-based diets and those incentivizations or plant-based products. When we look at labeling requirements across multiple markets, there's significant constraints and restrictions in the plant-based space that just don't apply to meat and dairy. So how do we create some equity in that? An equitable space at the very least might help. The other areas that I think are really important, that are triggers that can help, are things like public procurement, and where advertising support goes to support farmers who also grow plants. Let's be clear, farmers grow plants as well as raising animals. And so I think there's a whole suite of interventions that can be looked at on the policy side that can help with that dietary shift that holds this very unique and immediate opportunity to address the methane challenge. Talked a bit about disclosure. Obviously, methane disclosure would be a really good thing in this space. Nothing like a bit of radical transparency to drive some action and to inform yourself as a company about what you need to do and what's worth focusing on. I'm just looking at my notes and thinking, I think I've probably covered it inadvertently, because maybe I know what I'm talking about for once, which is a bit of a surprise.
So I'm trying to think there's a lot to be learned by sharing experiences across these policies is essentially, I'm trying to figure, I have nothing to add. I should have just given this back. I think that the point being, though, is one of the things that the Climate and Clean Air Coalition does is organize exchange of information between governments at the national and the subnational levels, because one of the things in some of these policy spaces, not all of them are necessarily at the top federal level. Some of these policies need to be implemented at more local levels. So I think I'm thinking more on the implementation side. How do you learn from what's been implemented so that what works can actually be used in more spaces? And so that would be the only thing I have to add, is that it's important because I have not seen as much attention to gathering all of those types of policies together in a useful way so that practitioners, advocates, members of the communities, but also industry can actually learn from one another. So that would basically be my one point, is essentially that's a piece between implementation, but also adopting other practices. Is I was just talking to some state regulators who asked me, their first question is, what are other jurisdictions doing? And I have about this much of a view, because there's actually not, to my knowledge, and please correct me if someone has this all worked up, as much information on the types of policies and practices that work in this space.
Do you know again?
Yeah, I remembered. I mean, subsidies reform, I think it's really critical. Last year we had a UN report that said 90% of agriculture subsidies go into something that is like bad for climate, health, or biodiversity. And it's like huge wasted money that we could be using for something better. And then the other thing I wanted to say, it's not just about personal consumer choice, it's about food environments. And that's really like the key word. It's about like what kind of choices we're, we're forced to make with the environment where we are. And just to mention COP27, right, where there's not a lot of options to make good food choices because, it's mostly kind of predetermined and it's mostly animal products. So that's one of the examples. But I think there are plenty of policies that could be out there. I think we should look at the transition of the food system similar as we did transport and energy systems, right? So we have alternatives and we should be growing those alternatives. And at the same time, we should be disincentivizing things that we know are bad for the climate.
Yeah, I mean, just to the point about practices, and I think happily, I mean, some of this has been a bit depressing, right? When you look at the numbers and the scale of the challenge, but actually, when you start to look in this space, you start to see some phenomenal examples of work that's coming through that really lends into this space. And I was also just reflecting on something like one of the WWF reports that came out this week, looking at retailers and calling for retailers to use all of those amazing mechanisms that they have to shift and incentivize plant-based, right? So particularly things like, how do you put in the line of sight of the consumer the plant-based choice instead of the meat or dairy-based choice? How do you use all of those nudges, behavioral nudges? So not all of this requires government policy. There are things that all actors can do, whether you're a retailer, whether you're a food service operator, whether you're a company. There's multiple things that multiple people can do across all fronts. And let's be clear, the scale of the challenge requires not just one perfect silver bullet, because that clearly isn't going to exist. It's going to require that concerted, collaborative effort across all actors and all players to push that forwards. But the central core of that is the ability to have a much better conversation about what we eat. And for that to be politically, socially acceptable, which is a really tough thing to do. We go into this space and it can be quite awkward because nobody likes to be told what they're supposed to eat, right?
So I would like to open the space for some questions. And if you have a question, please say who you are, where you're from, and what your question is. So who wants to go first? And we need to give one mic over. Maybe.
Thanks for all the Oh, can you hear me? Yep. The great presentations. My name's Macaulay Jones. I'm from the World Farmers Organization. So we represent about almost 100 farming organizations, large scale, small scale, farmers that farm livestock, farmers that farm plants, developed world. An issue that comes up a lot of the time amongst our members is, particularly amongst the developing country members, is food security, the food security crisis, and how can we improve productivity in these developing countries. And in doing so, there's also the opportunity to reduce emissions, to empower local people, in particular women working on farms. So my question is, what can we do better to help transfer management practices, technology, knowledge throughout the world, and in particular from the global north to the global south, to help improve food security, empower local people, and also, very importantly, reduce methane emissions? Thank you.
Who wants to take the question?
Maybe I would actually like to.
Anna, do you want to?
Do you hear me? No.
Alina, sorry, I didn't see that while the other women are still discussing. Just take the chance and answer the question.
Okay, thank you very much. So I have been thinking a lot about this question actually, because I've also been collaborating some with epidemiologists actually in Ethiopia on this, and because Ethiopia has a lot of pastoralist communities with a lot of, Africa in total has actually a quarter of all cattle in the world is in Africa. Even if Africa is only producing something like 5 to 10% of the total milk. So of course, it looks like an obvious solution to transfer high-yielding animals to Africa from Europe, for example, Holstein breeds and so on. And but it turns out that this is not always a very good solution, because these animals are not well adapted to these conditions there. They have, for example, in the stocks of these high-producing breeds that they have now introduced in some countries, some also in Ethiopia, they have a prevalence of 50% of different like TB, tuberculosis, and brucellosis, and so on. While in the local breed, the saber breed, you have a prevalence of 2 to 3%. And this is a huge health concern in these countries. It's a huge health issue. And there are also other problems with it, that you have those who now produce milk and meat in these countries are quite marginalized groups, and of course it would be very difficult to so it's not like you just give them better cows and then because the reason for them to keep cows is not only to produce milk and meat as it is in Europe, but it's also very much a way to manage risks, because they live very risky lives. They have basically no other sources to store assets for bad times, basically, than in their animals. So I think the only solution for these emissions is really the more complex solutions, where you improve resilience of these communities by providing protections for or funding for extreme events like many climate-induced extreme events, and also building public healthcare systems and education, and enhancing the empowering these communities actually. So I think we have to be aware of that. These simple solutions might seem easy, but they might not always work so well.
I saw some people nodding on stage and also in the audience. So thanks for this, Lina. Do we have another question? Nina.
Hi, I'm Nina from 4Paws, and I have a question about the business case. So Upfields is fully plant-based. What would you say to companies that haven't yet fully started that pathway? Is it a lucrative pathway for them to go? Why do you think they haven't moved yet? And what would you tell them to encourage them to shift?
Is this working? Yeah, it is. Good. So, I mean, I think the great news is that there's just a world of opportunity in the plant-based space, right? I mean, if it isn't apparent now, the need to shift, it's going to increasingly be. Consumers are increasingly looking for alternatives, but they have to be tasty, first and foremost, and they have to be affordable. So we've got to find ways to give people choices that make sense. They've got to make sense at that point of consumption when you walk into a supermarket or your local store or go to a market. They've got to make sense. And the business case for looking at methane specifically, when we're thinking about those numbers, I mean, it is part of that long-term, why do you act on climate anyway, right? So if you're looking at these numbers and thinking, if we don't tackle it, we're going to end up in a really very chronic climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, nature crisis, the numbers, when you start to look at the risks to business, if you've done any form of assessment on TCFD or TCND, or you start to look at those frameworks that help you to quantify the financial impact to a business, start to make some of those numbers look critically real. I mean, the other thing to consider in this space is, imagine if you were looking at the cost of carbon in the future and price that into your choice of ingredients today. And if you were to price in the cost of carbon comparatively across your portfolio of ingredients, you would imagine what those ingredients are going to cost you in the future and whether that makes you competitive in that space. So if you're not innovating solutions that allow you to reduce the amount of meat and dairy, provide new offerings to consumers, you're missing a great opportunity.
I think you raise really interesting points about how, we just look at profitability at this narrow aspect, right? How much do I pay in the shop? But actually, it's much more than that. And we kind of, I think if companies start to take their own climate targets seriously, it would really change the way they see this. It would change the way, it would really become much more clearer. Like, for example, if you're a retailer, you have to shift to 50% plant-based because, if you want to meet just for the sake of your climate targets, right? And then what we also warned previously, we did this investor briefing, right? Where investors are hugely concerned. We did a survey. They're hugely concerned about climate change. 2/3 of investors think that meat and dairy industry has a risk of stranded assets. And 83% want meat and dairy companies to reduce their methane emissions, and 70% want them to report them. So these are really quite high numbers. And when you look at the climate science, it's mostly not included in the growth projections for the industry, for meat and dairy, right? We have, everyone says 50% increase by 2050. But if you look at the climate science with 2-degree temperature increase, you're looking at, I think it's 7 to 10% contraction of livestock only with 2 degrees. And if you have higher temperature increases, you're talking about a third of agricultural areas becoming unsuitable. And these areas actually coincide with where we have majority of feed and livestock production. So this is really something that I'm surprised, that the industry is not taking into account when they're doing their assessment, their analysis, their growth projections. There seems to be like quite a big disconnect.
I think we could take a last question, if there is a last question.
Hi there, I'm Robbie Blake from IPES Food. I'm just wondering, just to throw a bit of spice in there, whether you see that there is opportunity for building some consensus between the different kind of viewpoints that we've heard on this panel. I'm thinking, the Netherlands has seen big farmer protests. The EU, in the EU space, we've seen moves to try and restrict the way that plant-based alternatives are marketed and labeled. They're not allowed to be called milk anymore. And yet it seems there are really good, efforts going on many fronts. So do you think there is space for consensus, and what would that look like?
Who wants to take this one?
I mean, I can start. I think it is like food agriculture. It's really something that policymakers don't want to touch, but we see a lot of movement on the market, and I think people are starting to realize that this is, important kind of personal thing that they can do for climate, health, etc. Right? So a lot of people are taking this, and again, I said before, it's not about consumer choice only, right? It's about what do we do with this now? It's about is there now more policymakers, ministers going to be braver and go out there and kind of talk about it, and then eventually put policies in place, and things can start moving really, really quickly. We were gripped by a horrible drought last year that really impacted the production, the prices, and everything in Europe. We're not talking about Sahel region, we're talking about Mediterranean, and even north of Europe. So I think we might see things moving much faster than what we thought. And, Robbie knows me from my previous life. I used to work on transport. And when we started, electric cars were like a distant dream. And now it's happening, right? And we're talking about electric trucks. So this is food. And I think actually changes can happen much faster than what we think.
Yeah, I think, is that me? No. Again, what's with this microphone? Now, I think what's really important is that we all start moving as fast as we can, whether governments tell us to do so or not. So to make sure the carbon footprint of dairy keeps reducing, the carbon footprint of plant-based drinks keeps on reducing, and that we all look at how we can avoid wasting food, how we can avoid flying to Egypt, or do whatever we can ourselves, because eventually it starts with yourself. We are the ones who are buying, we are the ones who are consuming. So let's all just try ourselves if the world around us is not moving fast enough.
Yeah, I think I agree. There's some framing aspect to this, right? So it comes back to at the moment we seem to be running a debate that says less or better. It has to be much better and much less if we're going to hit 1.5. So credit to the industry for what they're doing, but let's also create the space for this conversation on what we eat, because there isn't enough space in policy right now for us to do what we need to do. And let's make sure that we enable each other in those journeys rather than put roadblocks in the way of each other in that endeavor.
Okay, thank you so much. Stepping out of my facilitator role, I would like to add that we should never forget about the animal, because of course we speak about dairy all the time, but this is about cows. So let's not forget about that. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of the session. I think I forgot to mention this in the beginning. This session was co-hosted by 4PAWS, the Humane Society International, and Upfield. And yeah, thank you so much to the amazing panel. Have a nice Friday evening and see you soon. Thank you so much.